Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. Billy is off today, and I just wanted to share with you a couple of things that we were going to have go on today with guests. You know, one of the things is I've always wondered, and I don't know, maybe you have too, is, you know, we have some of these violent storms that have been going on, and, you know, the rain and then the severe cold and, you know, that kind of thing. And it's like, how do animals adapt to that? You know, and what do they do? So we have Dr. Matt Springer. He's an associate extension professor of wildlife here in our department. He's going to be talking about wildlife habitat and how they adapt to different weather situations. And we also have Dr. Ellen Crocker, who is assistant professor of forest health, and she is going to be on talking about what's bugging my tree. And at this time of year, you're probably seeing some of those issues go on. And so I thought it would be a good time for have Dr. Crocker on. So speaking of Dr. Crocker, she is on with us today.
Hello, good morning, Renee. How's it going?
And how are you?
Oh, great. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Always good to talk about what's bugging our trees.
So what you're saying you were going to talk about summer galls. What exactly is that?
A gall is just an abnormal growth or swelling and kind of like a tumor-like growth, and you can find them on tree leaves and stems and branches and all sorts of different things. Lots of different things can cause galls, from insects to fungi to just kind of a weird growth response on the plant's part. And usually it's not a big deal for the health of the tree, but it can look really weird.
They're called summer galls. Does this only happen in the summer?
No, you can find galls other times of year. These are just some that you might commonly find in the summer. Obviously, those galls that are on like the leaves, because we have leaves when the leaves are out. If you're looking for those kinds of galls, that's just going to be when the leaves are on. But for some of the other galls, like the more woody galls that might be on your branches and your twigs, you can see some of those even after the leaves have fallen. Now, they're not going to be active and, you know, growing as in the winters as much, but you might still be able to see signs of them.
Okay. All right. Well, looking forward to your video.
Great. And this is something we recorded a few years back, and but the galls remain the same. The galls, even though we recorded this video a couple of years ago, you'll probably still find a lot of these galls out and about.
What's that weird thing on your tree's leaves? Midsummer is a time when I get lots of calls about galls, abnormal growths on trees. While lots of different things can cause galls, most of the ones that we see in our area are caused by insects that have found a clever way to turn these leaves into their food and their house. In this edition of What's Bugging My Tree, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those summertime tree galls, some of the most common ones you might see, and the insects that cause them. Galls are a general term for irregular plant growths. This can come in lots of different shapes, sizes, and places, from barely noticeable to weird tumor-like swellings. Galls can occur anywhere on the plant, from leaves to bark to flowers to roots. Different things can trigger the formation of galls in plants. Some are caused by pathogens like fungi and bacteria. Some are part of the plant's natural wound response to some kind of damage. But the most common cause of galls on our shade trees are insects and mites. Insect galls are frequently caused by the development of a wasp or fly larvae inside the plant, with the insect emitting different growth regulating chemicals that cause the plant to produce this abnormal growth. The insect gains nutrients from the inner gall tissue and also protects itself against natural enemies, and, much to the disappointment of gardeners, insecticide sprays that make the galls really difficult to control. Here you can see the ash flower gall. It's caused by small mites that distort those male flowers of the ash trees. The galls are initially green, and then they'll dry and they'll turn a brown color. Unlike the healthy flowers that you might see, these are going to stay on the tree through the winter. And you might wonder, what are those, brown balls up in my ash tree? Those are the ash flower galls. Another really common gall that I see all the time and love to play with, especially with kids, is the hackberry nipple gall. These are small, aphid-like insects called psyllids that have sucking mouth parts. If you carefully cut them open, you may even see a tiny developing psyllid inside. The adults look just like tiny cicadas, and they can be a nuisance when the cold weather comes and they try to find shelter indoors, sometimes in large numbers. But they're harmless to both people and hackberry trees, which aren't hurt by these galls, although they can be prolific in number. They're really easy to find on the underside of hackberry leaves, but if you look at them, you'll notice that the upper surface of those leaves is still green, they're still photosynthesizing, and it doesn't really hurt the tree too much. Even poison ivy is not immune from getting galls. Here you can see some with galls that are produced by tiny little mites, warty growths on the upper surface that are quite common in our area. These really noteworthy galls are called elm sac galls, and they're caused by an aphid and have this deep red color. If you open them inside the right time of year, you're going to find them filled with tiny little aphids. Despite their appearance, they don't really hurt the tree. Oak trees in general are host to so many different insects, and this applies when it comes to galls, with hundreds of different gall-causing insects on oak trees. Oak apple galls, which are large, spongy growths that then turn papery when they get old. Jumping oak galls, which are tiny little galls that you see on the underside of leaves that are caused by tiny little wasps. And they're really easy to miss, although you might notice the leaves turning a little brown on the upper surface. If you flip it over, those tiny little dots will each have one tiny little gall. Maple spindle galls are another common gall this time of year, with these kind of really eye-catching spiky spindles on the upper surface of maple leaves, particularly sugar maple. You might also see what are called maple bladder galls, which on silver and red maple tend to be more warty galls that occur on the upper surface, and those are caused by mites. You might even see the maple eye spot gall, which, as its name implies, kind of looks like an eye. Particularly on red maples, you'll see these occasionally, and they're caused by a small fly. It's a leaf miner that is going to have a little larvae right in the center of that eye, so if you peel it back, you might find it. While galls might look bad, they don't really damage trees and mostly aren't worth your time from a management perspective. This is really true of those leaf galls that we just talked about that might look really eye-catching and striking, but they don't really hurt those trees. Those trees can still photosynthesize through the summer just fine. But if you really don't like them, there are some insecticide options out there on your landscape trees. However, I would say that the timing is really tricky on those, because by the time you notice that damage, that gall has already been in your tree for a while, been maturing, and is going to be really hard to control until the following spring. And then that timing is really key, because you're thinking of the timing that happens maybe at bud break, when those insect females are laying those eggs. The most damaging galls are those that impact the twigs and the formation of new growth and tissue. Things like horned oak gall or gouty oak gall. Most of the time, though, even these aren't a problem if you just have a gall here or there. But if you have stressed landscape trees, or maybe a low diversity of trees in an area that these galls can just sweep through, you might see a lot more. If you can catch those early, you can prune them out. Otherwise, management can be really difficult because insecticides are typically not very effective. Thanks for joining me today in this tree tidbit and learning a little bit more about the diversity of summer galls. If you liked what you learned today, make sure to check us out online and follow us on social media.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully you learned a little bit about these weird, wild, and wonderful galls. I'm always like, I know some of them can certainly cause damage to trees, but others are just so fascinating, and there's so many of them, and they really are not hurting the trees.
So now there's a difference between like what they call a burl, right? Is that right? And then a gall. Those are two totally
Well, that's a
different
really
things.
good question. I would think of a burl as being like a gall on the main trunk of the tree,
Mhm.
but a lot of different different types of organisms might cause that.
Mhm.
Sometimes the burl is going to be just the tree's natural response to some wounding. Trees, when they're wounded, they can never heal like we would. They tend to seal off that damage, and sometimes they will like get carried away and seal. And there's a lot of this kind of wound response on the tree's part. A lot of times, though, there are some bacteria and other microorganisms that can cause that burl response, cause that like overgrowth of tissue that results in what we see as a burl. But again, the same kind of thing in that you've got an overgrowth of tissue on that tree's part and a normal swelling or growth there.
I was just noticing because I notice a lot of people actually look for that for they
Oh,
make
yeah,
and things like that out of the wood. So I've heard that they can
beautiful.
be very beautiful. So
Yeah, for sure.
well, thank you very much for that. That way we know what we're kind of looking at and whether it's a problem or not. So we appreciate you doing all that for us.
Well, we always want to be attentive to what's going on in our trees,
Mhm.
and keep an eye out for anything abnormal or unusual. And some of these galls certainly are abnormal and unusual. But fortunately, this is one of those cases where you can see it and you can look it up and be like, okay, whew, not something major that I've got to worry about. I thought I'd share with your audience today that I was out last week and I saw a poison ivy plant that were just totally covered with galls. Like it looked like the poison ivy leaves had poison ivy because they were just like covered with these warty blistery galls all over the leaves, red, like bright red color. I was like, serves you right, poison ivy. That's
It's
what
like
you
a
get.
Halloween show. Some of those
Yeah.
you had where it was coming out of the leaves, I was like, ooh.
Yeah. Very clever on the part of those insects, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I didn't even realize until you showed that picture that like when you cut that one open, there was actually insect inside of it. You never even thought about that.
Yeah. And not always, like not on more of those fungal galls and other types of galls, but yes, I think that that's fascinating. What a way to make dinner and a home for yourself.
Right,
Like,
exactly. Oh, that's a way to look
oh,
at it.
oh,
Thank you, Ellen. We
you
greatly
are so welcome. Thank you.
appreciate it. So we are going to move on to our other topic, which is wildlife. With they're trying to do like how do wildlife do like extreme cold, extreme weather, extreme temperatures? We Dr. Matt Springer did a video for us because he couldn't be here today, but it was really interesting, I think, to even think about. It's like what do they do? When they're out in this extreme stuff. We go into our house. Well, what do they do, and how do they survive in this extreme cold and extreme heat? So we are going to go ahead and play a video on that.
Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the really fascinating things that wildlife can do and does in order to survive different environmental factors that they encounter, whether that be weather, the season, or other pressures that may cause them to be in some form of danger in terms of their survival. So I want to start off by kind of framing this in a way that gives you some perspective in terms of a lot of these behaviors and what animals do, wildlife does to survive. Broadly, they can be classified into two different types of groups in terms of these behaviors. We have the ultimate behavior in terms of um, the pressures that cause this type of behavior for survival usually are related to evolution, whether that's more survival or just fitness outcomes. You can think of these as things like avoidance of inbreeding depression and dispersal, where a juvenile leaves its home range so that it lowers the likelihood of inbreeding. And we can see some negative influences of that and how those pressures would exist by looking at the Isle Royale wolf populations right now, where they're having extreme issues with their health and survival because of that inbreeding depression. So the pressure there was to avoid that, and therefore, they come up with behaviors to increase survival, increase the likelihood of success. Other type of behavior is called proximate. And this generator for these type of behaviors are usually some kind of environmental cue specific to that area that triggers a predictable behavior response. Things like, the gaping in birds can be viewed as a approximate factor where certain individuals may gape more than others, and therefore the adults will put food into the larger mouse versus others in the same nest. Sometimes these behaviors are things like density dependence, where if you're a deer in an area that, if you're a young deer or young male deer in an area that has a lot of adult male deer present, then your competition for breeding success is going to be a lot higher. And that cue of seeing a lot more males around may push you to leave the area to increase your likelihood of breeding success in your lifetime. So that would be potentially a proximate cue. So a lot of our behaviors, though, when we look at it, are coming, either one or the other, or a lot of times both are occurring. And if we think about how animals experience the environment, especially here in Kentucky, where we have, multiple different types of seasons, we have a growing season, we have winter, we have, fall, spring, and what is going on in the environment is drastically different in every one of those seasons. And often we think of those ecosystems, right, and how they're functioning with each other, whether that be the environment and the weather and influencing the plants and animals and wildlife that all live there, the insects, and how they're also then interacting with each other, right? So, the main part of surviving here is for a lot of our wildlife is they've got to eat. And then they worry about reproduction. So if you look at the food chain and how that works, right, you have the energy from the sun coming down to your primary producers, your plants. You then get into the consumers. A lot of times those are insects. They can also be other wildlife, right? So things like deer are a primary consumer because they're eating the plants directly. But we have a very complex and interactive food chain that varies depending on where you are in the state or even what system you're in the state, whether that be an urban environment, a grassland, a forest, and so on. So as those cycles go through, especially as we approach fall and winter, we get to see that plants and insects are responding to the environment where, your sunlight decreases, your colder temperatures are impacting those plants. They're not growing as much. There's not as much vegetative material present. Because of that, you have a response in a lot of times in the insect communities as well that are dealing with the same issue. So you're having a lot of flux in terms of that food chain in itself. So when we think about wildlife survival, how are they dealing with those changes in food availability? Also, you get into things like cold issues, right? So temperature extremes, weather extremes. So they have a lot of survival techniques associated with dealing with either food shortages or temperature extremes. Those are kind of the two major pressures that we have here in Kentucky. But more broadly in general across the world. So let's kind of get into a little bit of that. How to specifically, most of what we see are a lot more cold tolerant or cold related strategies for animals to survive. So we talked about how there's a giant change in the sun, right, and the plant community responds to that lack of sunlight. They're not growing as much. Which means in general, there's just less food around and you have colder temperatures, which if you're a mammal or a bird, means your metabolism is working harder to keep you warm, and therefore you need more calorie intake to survive. So dealing with that cold and lack of food, one of the easiest things for them to do is just leave, right? So we see migration is a huge strategy amongst the wildlife that we have present in Kentucky. And what migration really is just the act of moving from one spatial area to another. And it's really done to promote fitness and survival. Distances can vary quite a bit across, if we think about migration worldwide, where we see some that are small in scale, where it may be more reproductive related, but others can be rather large. And we have both altitudinal, altitude migration. So say a animal is living at the top of a mountain, it comes to the bottom during the cold to escape that temperature change, right, in elevation. And we also see latitudinal. So you can think of that as your north-south migration, which a lot of our birds and our bats do. Okay. We see this, this is not just an avian adaptation. We see it in mammals. in both completely, our bats I mentioned. We see this especially in mammals in Africa, our large hoofed mammals, right? You think about the wildebeest migrations. We see it in whales, in ocean settings. But we see a lot more altitudinal migration is more common, especially in North America, with things like elk and pronghorn sheep, deer, and so on. There's even, a funny movie that I remember seeing when I was little, that Disney put out that related to lemmings, and the story around lemming migrations where they jump off cliffs, which was completely a falsity created by Disney to make a really entertaining video. So they do migrate north-south a little bit, but most of the time they're not jumping off the cliff. But we do see this, especially in our species in Kentucky, with bats in terms of mammal migration. We don't see it as much in other mammals. They have implemented different strategies that we're going to get into in a little bit to deal with the cold and lack of food. But in terms of migrations in general for mammals, they do exist. They're just not one that our mammals here in Kentucky use. However, on the avian side, this one is used incredibly at high rates for a lot of our bird species, our neotropical migrants that come to Kentucky to breed in the spring, summer, and then leave in the fall and pass through and go back south to deal with warmer temperatures in the winter versus what we have present here in Kentucky. Some of it is quite impressive, but most of the time it's thought that they're doing this act to exploit the resources that are on a seasonal basis. So we have basically a summer pulse of insects and food availability that would allow them to feed their young and maintain the calorie intake and the nutritional intake that they need to grow very quickly to migrate themselves down to this near the equator to survive the winter. They are relatively impressive at how well they do migrate, and they each, every species has its own strategy. Some will fly short distances. Maybe they only go down to the southern US, Alabama, Florida. Others will fly all the way down to South America. So it just depends on the individual species. But we see we are the end point for northern species like waterfowl, where we have a lot of wintering waterfowl in western Kentucky. So it all depends on the actual species itself. So we end up picking up species in the summer, we lose some in the fall, and we also gain some in the fall, and then that cycle continues. And then if you're a birder, you know that some individuals will get lost in the process, and sometimes we have weird things that show up because of weather issues, and like flamingos in Kentucky, as well as many other things. I just heard that there was a caracara up in Indiana, which is an oddity as well. So it's not perfect, but they are quite impressive at their ability to home and also find where they need to get to on an annual cycle. Some returning exactly back to the same point in space year after year. Migrations are also seen in herps. These are usually associated with two different kind of cycles. More reproductive migration for sure on the herps rather than necessarily cold tolerance, but the cold migrations that we do see are things like hibernaculums for snakes, where they'll travel potentially miles across the landscape to get to the same area to hibernate in the winter, and sometimes in large groups. We hear about these a lot with snakes, especially rattlesnakes. And then there's an area in southern Illinois called Snake Road where you can actually go in the spring and the fall and see this migration happening from the bottomlands into the hills there, that they have the bluffs where the herps all go and spend the winter. We do see migrations as well for reproductive purposes in terms of things like small scale salamanders going to vernal pools to lay eggs, frogs, toads, same thing. And then if you think globally, we see migrations like sea turtles going to beaches and to lay their eggs. So this is a common strategy used across herps in general. We see, unfortunately, it's end of May, June is the time we see a lot of our female turtles get hit in the roads because they're going to try to find nest sites for their eggs. So we can see that, and on the local scale with, the sea turtles going to nest on beaches. So there's a lot of movement going on that is a strategy for them for reproductive success, but we also see it in terms of strategy for cold tolerance. Because we're on the theme of migrations, and one of the most charismatic species that we hear a lot about right now is the monarch, and we are definitely seeing migration in a different pattern with monarchs, right? So this is more a generational migration where it's not like one monarch goes all the way north and then comes all the way back south to Mexico to spend the winter. They're laying eggs and having different generations along the way. And finally, that last generation, which some come from Kentucky that make their way all the way down to where they overwinter. We just had one that was tagged here in Kentucky and confirmed down there. I believe it was 2 years ago. So we see that as a strategy where they're being so tied to milkweed and also the floral abundance for nectar. They're going to bop along to take advantage of those resources when they're there, and then their strategy to deal with when they're not present is to go down south and migrate, similar to what we see in avian species. And since we're talking about monarchs, we're going to switch gears here to another survival tactic that's really an anti-predator tactic, which is mimicry. And we see this across various different taxa as well, including the viceroy and the monarch, which is kind of what sparks this transition here, where the monarch has got some toxicity to it from consuming the milkweed, where the viceroy does not. But the viceroy is trying to play off that monarch's evolutionary trait for survival and use it to its advantage. We see that in terms of insects as well, and using predators of their predator, right? So we see owls and the owl eyes with moths. And then also we see another version of the monarch where we have with snakes, where they're trying to mimic the venomous species, even though they're non-venomous. So ones that we have present here are king snakes in Kentucky, are red, black, and yellow, the same colors as our coral snakes, which we do not have in Kentucky, but are just south of us. And you get down into Georgia. So you see red, black, and yellow on the coral snakes, and they have a nice saying, red on yellow, you will kill a fellow, red on black, and you're all right, Jack. So we have the snakes that have the red to black. But many bird species are not going to sit there and say that to themselves, right, before trying to grab the snake. So they're going to avoid grabbing any of the imitators. And it plays some advantage to them because they're all still here, and they are definitely abundant across the landscape in terms of mimicry. Other versions of mimicry we also see in snakes are behavioral. We do have rattlesnakes here in Kentucky, and one of the best ways a rattlesnake is around is you hear that rattle going, right? That snake is telling you, I am venomous, I am something to not be messed with. Well, other snakes also rattle their tails, especially though, like a gray rat snake in the leaves is going to rattle its tail if it wants you to think it's big and scary and also a problem. And it sounds eerily similar to a rattle. On top of that, our snakes like to flatten out their heads. So this is a diamondback water snake. And it is here flattening out its head to look like a pit viper that we have in its same range that is known to be venomous, right? So it's trying to give that image that it is also potentially a viper and not to be messed with. So they're keying in on some of those evolutionary advantages that other species have that are very dangerous, that are really easy cues to predators to not to predate animals. They're trying to use that to their advantage to increase their survival. So other versions of cold tolerance that we see here in Kentucky that a lot of people are familiar with are just they're kind of ride it out by sleeping through it, and that sleep can come in one form or another. We have a few that are true hibernators that are completely shutting down, almost stopping their metabolism for a really extended period of time. These are things like groundhogs and chipmunks. Or we have others that go through a torpor, which is a cycle of slower metabolism that the animal kind of comes out of. the metabolism, about every 14-ish days or so, depending on the species you're talking about, will start coming back around and increasing again. So bears are ones that fall into that, bats as well, where they're not true hibernators, where they completely shut down, but will kind of cycle through and use the ability of slowing the metabolism down, where they're surviving off of their energy stores and fat to basically make it through those cold months where food isn't available. We see that a little bit in other species, including hibernation in reptiles with turtles and snakes. And we actually have a species of bird in the United States. It's a porwheel, the common porwheel out in the Rockies, that'll go through a torpor-like state as well. As you can see, it's kind of hiding in this lower right picture there. Our version of this is the whippoorwill. But our whippoorwills will migrate south. One of the most amazing ones that really has been studied a lot for human health, I believe, is the wood frogs go through this cryobiology kind of fascinating function where they increase the amount of glucose and urea in their systems. And it allows them to actually almost freeze more than halfway solid for a period of up to 8 months. These guys, their range stretches all the way up into Alaska, where a lot of our other amphibians here will kind of bury themselves deep in soil, but deep enough that our temperatures do not cause them to freeze solid. They'll just get very cold. Well, where these guys exist up in Alaska, they can't put themselves deep enough to not freeze solid. So evolutionarily, they have come up with this technique of surviving being frozen. It's really interesting. There's been a lot of research into it, looking at how this may play a role in something like a heart surgery for humans, right? So really neat evolutionary behavior that has allowed this animal to extend its range into places that it wouldn't normally be able to. Then there's others that have figured out ways of surviving without either leaving or going into some kind of hibernation torpor. A lot of times that relates to what is their diet and what is actually available. So many of our carnivores are able to find prey enough to keep those calories up and not lose weight, even in really poor weather conditions and temperatures. Right? You can think about foxes and many of these, especially canine predators. Their hunting ability is actually probably better in the cold than during the summer because they're able to kind of find rodents easier than when vegetation is really thick. Other species, have the ability of eating woody material, not just leafy vegetative green growth. Think about deer, right? And a lot of times we see a lot of damage in our landscaping from deer, especially in northern parts of our country during winter months when they're just browsing as much as possible. The nutritional value is lower, but they are able to kind of overcome that with their digestive efficiency and still have high nutritional intake. So those are kind of some of the summaries of neat behaviors that help survival here in Kentucky. I just want to kind of end this talk with some other really interesting behaviors and physiological changes that are really cool for wildlife, whether it's reproductive or survival based. So many of us have seen, or if you haven't seen Life of Birds, that's run by David Attenborough. Really cool features of many birds of paradise and other tropical species that have really intricate mating rituals and dances and songs and displays. The plumage kind of lines up to that. Really neat, and also somewhat you question why they would evolutionarily have those things in place, but awesome displays and awesome plumage. But other features, we talked about migration with birds. One of the cool physiological traits that happens for migration is their body changes drastically. Their organs change drastically. Certain parts of their organs will get smaller, some will get larger, and it kind of goes through this cycle. A lot of times they will shrink their stomachs because they're not consuming a lot during flight to lower their their mass of organs and allow them to increase their muscle mass for flight strength and abilities. Remember that their wing ratio to weight matters a lot. So putting on muscle to fly, you have to lose something else. So it's really, really interesting to watch them go through these cycles and have this ability to basically grow organs and shrink organs to accommodate those really long distance migration movements. Other ones, so chickadees are known to have their parts of their brain grow in fall as they're caching seeds away for winter, so that they can remember where those seeds are. I think it's teen percentages of growth in their brain during that period of time to help remember where seeds are put so they can have a food cache easily found in the winter. There are bird species that, especially a type of parrot, that'll actually name their kids. They'll have individual calls to their young to communicate and ensure that they're able to locate and feed them enough to increase their survival as young and not just favor one young over another. And going along with that, birds in general have all these really intricate, neat little behaviors, but many of them, even the same species, will have accents depending on where they are or dialects to communicate to other individuals what's going on in their landscape. And that's because a lot of times they're very spatially tied to each other over long periods of time, even though they have the ability to interbreed across other individuals that were in other places. They have communication that is specific to things they encounter in their local landscapes. And lastly, one of the ones I like to throw in there for my college students, just because it gets a laugh, but it is not unique to humans to have the oldest profession, where they have these weird behaviors, where there's the Adelaide penguins will actually try to buy reproductive rights by bringing stones to females. And one penguin had to bring 60 plus stones to a female to gain reproductive access for that one copulation event. So those features do exist in other wildlife species outside of humans, interestingly enough. And with that, I'm going to end it. And I apologize for not being present for the show and answer questions. But if you shoot me an email, I'm happy to get it and answer any questions you may have simply at mattspringer@uky.edu. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Enjoyed this kind of real quick summary of really interesting behaviors and adaptations that animals have to survive here in Kentucky and in their systems abroad and throughout the world.
Wow. That was very interesting. And to be honest, I don't know if you're anything like this, but man, I wish I had that bird's ability to grow the brain thing, because I know I really need it because, sometimes I can't remember where I put my keys, so if we could have that ability, wouldn't that be amazing? So there was a lot of interesting things in there, of what animals can do. Every time, that he gives a presentation, I'm awed by what animals actually can do and learned a lot in that. And then also with Dr. Ellen Crocker, all about summer galls and, learning about what all those different ones were. There were really some fascinating pictures there on what all these different galls were, and some that, that they don't hurt the trees, so you're okay. It's very interesting to see all of that. So we greatly appreciate you joining us today. Next week, we were going to have forestry careers, and we will be talking about all the different forestry careers that are out there. We have another topic that's going to be up, but we're just kind of waiting on that for a presenter on that to go over that. And then so next week, that's next week. But if you miss a show or have not seen one specifically, you're like, oh, what did they say? You can always go to FromTheWoodsToday.com and you can get all of our backdated shows. So there's like over 250 episodes on there. So there's a lot of information. We have everything from tree ID to forest health to wildlife and everything in between. So there's a lot on, if you, like I said, go to FromTheWoodsToday.com and you will find all of that information. Also, when you're on there, there's a little survey. Shoot us a link, tell us some topics that you'd like to see, because we do this for you. If we weren't doing this for you, then we wouldn't have a show. So if you see something in your woods that you're just like, I don't know, maybe you saw a gull and Dr. Ellen Crocker needs to know about it, send that information to us, and we will go ahead and get that sent present to the right person, or possibly do a show on it. So you just never know what we might do with it. So we greatly appreciate you joining us each and every week, and we will see you all next week. Take care. Bye.
From the woods today. From the woods today.